Hello and welcome to the first lesson on widgets in the OutSystems platform. A widget is an element of graphical user interface that displays information or provides a specific way for a user to interact with an application, and you normally have specific widgets to capture or display information data of specific types. In this lesson we will cover some of the basic widgets that the OutSystems platform provides for you. These are the most common widgets you will see in every screen in every application done with OutSystems. First, we will show you some basic display widgets, those that just convey text to the user. Then we'll talk a little bit about inputs, and finally look into some of the most basic navigation and interaction widgets. To use a widget in your module, you will have to open the screen editor, and on the left hand side you will have the toolbox displaying the available widgets. Simply drag and drop the widget you want to use into the screen canvas and it will be available for you. The first widget is the expression widget, which is used to display calculated values in the screen. If you specify an example, this will show up in the preview while you're editing your module. There's an interesting property that this widget has, which is the escape content. If you set it to yes, it will allow you to inject HTML into the page. In the interest of security, the default value for this property is no. The free text that you type into your screen is also wrapped by a text widget. This allows you to then, for example, apply styling into the text. The simplest widget to gather information from the user is the input widget, allowing him to type in any information. Every single input is actually bound to a variable that will hold whatever it is that is typed into by the user. You can specify what type of input data we expect on this widget. And it's worth noting that the visual look of an input might change depending on the data that is associated with it. If you want to force the user to provide some information into this input before submitting the form that it's part of, you need to set it as mandatory. If you specify a null value in a non-mandatory property, if the user leaves it blank, this will be the value that's assigned to the bound variable. Finally, you can specify the prompt property. This will give the user a hint of what you expect to be typed in to this input. Now that we've mentioned input widgets, we can go back and talk about the third basic display widget, which is the label. Much like in an expression, you can specify the value to be displayed and an example for preview purposes. Where it differs from the expression is that you can specify an input widget on the current screen that will be bound to this label. This means that if the input is mandatory, the label will have a visual cue indicating so. Likewise, in the interest of accessibility, if you click on the label, the caret, the focus, will move to the associated input. The final set of basic widgets is the button and the link that will allow the user to trigger an action or navigate to a different screen. These widgets always require a destination, which is either the screen action that has the code that will be executed or a target screen to navigate to. The method of actually submitting or navigating is specified by the method, and this will be covered in a later lesson. It is possible to specify a confirmation message. This will make a pop-up show up before the link or button is actually followed. Mechanically speaking, buttons and links work much the same way, but since the link is actually more flexible in terms of what it can contain, it might be preferable to use in modern applications because, for example, you can inject an icon into it. Now that we talked about the building blocks, the most basic of widgets, let's look into how these can be grouped together to convey more complex information or to grab compound information from the user. We'll talk about a couple of layout widgets, the container and the table, and a couple of record widgets, the form and the table records. The first layout widget is the container, which allows you to group widgets and then apply a style or apply a behavior into the combination of these widgets. It is nothing more than a box that can contain other widgets, and you can specify its width, although its height is normally based on the contents therein. It also allows you to specify a certain style and a certain position of that cluster of widgets that's inside of the container. One of the practical uses of this is, for example, hiding the whole group of widgets that are inside via the display property. A container underneath is nothing more than a div element, if you know the HTML element. Another structural widget is the table widget that displays the contents in a table kind of way. You can specify upon creating the number of columns and rows that you want for your table. After the table is created, you can dynamically, in the editor, create new columns, remove columns, the same thing about rows, and move them about using the toolbar. It goes without saying that the cells of a table can contain other widgets, and although you can specify dimensions by the nature of the HTML table cells, the height and the width will actually respect the contents of it. Because of this sometimes odd behavior, the tables are falling out of favor in modern development, so you don't see them around too much anymore. Let's look now into a couple record widgets. They're called so because, unlike the base widgets that we saw before, they operate over a record or list of records depending on the type of the record widget. What they do have in common in terms of operation is that they are bound to this compound variable, and their children, the base widgets that are contained inside, in turn bind to particular fields or particular attributes on the data property of the record widget. So in a sense, the record widget works as a sort of a proxy or a wrapper for all the children widgets inside, delegating the variable that it is bound to it into those child widgets. Let's start with the form widget. The form widget allows you to show and specially edit a single record. It can contain input widgets inside and provides a local property to hold this input data. Furthermore, it has a source record that defines what is the data type of this local property. And also it's used to fill in the local property with the initial values. Inputs inside bind to the form's local property, and when you submit, they are validated together. One thing important to note is that it can contain not just input widgets, but any other kind of widgets. So really, inside the form, you don't really have any layout constraints. So you can add, for example, containers, inputs, labels, etc., etc. And in fact, if you use the drag and drop accelerator to drag attributes and build up your form, you'll see that actually it's created for you a container with a label and an input per attribute. And while the form widget deals with one single record for display or editing, you have the table records which displays multiple records in a kind of a tabular format. Much like the form, it also provides a local property to hold data. And you specify a source record list that defines the type of this local property and also initializes the local property list with a copy of your source record list. So in a sense, it's very, very similar in terms of binding mechanics with the form. Once you're actually rendering, once you're actually building the screen using a table records, the table records iterates through the local property list, displaying one row, one record per line on the local property list. Much like in the table widget, each cell of a table records can contain other widgets, and similarly, you can use the table toolbar also for table records to move and add and remove columns. If you use the drag and drop accelerator to build up your table records, by default it will create one column per each entity attribute that you drag into the table records. However, note that you're not forced to leave it like this, to leave this layout. You can change it afterwards. For example, you can opt to move the zip code expression that was built by the accelerator underneath the street and have a different layout. Okay, so you have the same flexibility as you also had in the form. Please note again, since the table records is pasted on top of an HTML table, the cell contents dimensions will stretch to hold whatever contents are inside. And that's basically it for the first batch of OutSystems widgets. See you guys in the next lesson.